I've been active in the skeptic movement since 1997, and I'm a proud participant to these kind of meetings. At the same time, for some reason, I developed a little bit of a reputation as a gadfly for the community. Now, in philosophy, there is a long tradition of gadflies. It started out with Socrates. I'm not him. I don't like hemlock, and I'm not going to drink it. So this is going to be a friendly version of gut flying. But I think that from time to time we do need to reflect also our own responsibilities and our own way of maybe making exaggerated claims. So this is actually a perfect segue with the previous talk, because you'll hear some of the same problems, except that at this time they are internally generated. So the word that we're talking about today is scientism, and what is it? I like to start simple and going straight to the dictionary. The Merriam-Webster defines it as an exaggerated trust in the efficacy of the methods of natural science applied to all areas of investigations, as in philosophy, social sciences, humanities, you name it. Now, if you think that there is no such thing as such an exaggeration, then you suffer from scientism. So that was the first point of diagnosis right there. Now, who exactly engages in scientism? Before we get to the details of how this thing works, and there are bits and pieces that are controversial about it, and we can have a discussion about it maybe over a coffee break, I'm going to give you some examples of who I think has engaged in it. You know this guy, when he argues that science can by itself provide answers to mortal questions and that philosophy is not needed. And then he proceeds to make an argument that is mostly based on philosophical assumptions that it doesn't justify. Neil, unfortunately, and Lawrence Krauss, and Stephen Hawking, and Steven Weinberg, this is the thing about physicists. When they declare that philosophy is useless to science or is dead or something like that, Stephen Hawking did that he declared philosophy dead at the beginning of his last book and then proceeded to do an entire volume on philosophy of cosmology without realizing it. Any number of neuroscientists, when they tell you that your brain on X, and they show you these really nice, colorful images of somebody's brain when he was doing something, that's the ultimate explanation, that's the most important explanation for X. Well, it's important to know how your brain works, but no, it isn't. It's only one locus of explanation. There's a lot of stuff that's going on and that your brain responds to, and the brain is not the ultimate and final cause of anything. A number of evolutionary psychologists, although crucially not all of them, when they make claims that go well beyond the epistemic warrant, as philosophers say, of the evidence that they provide. For instance, this infamous book known as The Rape and Natural History, which actually claims that rape is a natural phenomenon in human beings that evolved back in the Pleistocene on the basis of exactly no evidence at all. I mean, it could be. I'm not saying it didn't, but I thought we were into science, providing positive evidence, not just so stories. This is spread to the humanities. I've been at a conference where serious literature scholars went on saying that an evolutionary data-driven approach tells us much that is insightful about Jane Austen and her novels. And I was there as the token skeptic, and apparently what I learned about Jane Austen characters is that the women want to get married and the men trying to figure out the best woman to marry. I said, really? Because I'm not a Jane Austen scholar, but I could figure that one out without evolutionary biology. Oh, and this is an assignment for you guys over the coffee break. Several other people, including some present at this conference, including, surprise, surprise, some big names. You'll figure it out. I didn't want to help you too much. Now, the typical objection to when I raise the issue of scientism is that scientism is in fact used as a word of abuse by people who normally we don't really think very highly of, like creationists or intelligent design proponents or defenders of homeopathy and things like that. And that is true. Unfortunately, it has become a generic word of abuse. But then again, other words are being abused, and we still trying to maintain their integrity because they're useful words. After all, the word pseudoscience is thrown around now for all sorts of things, including things that are clearly not pseudoscientific. If you don't like a notion, you'll say, oh, that's pseudoscience. Even the word skepticism has a pretty bad reputation. A friend of mine years ago in the elevator was meeting a neighbor, and the neighbor was interested in the podcast that I was doing at the time, Rationally Speaking, with Julia Galef. And thank you. And that Julia still does, but listen to her. And so he was talking, and the neighbor was interested and said, so what do you guys call your organization? Inner City Skeptics. Oh, you guys are the cynics. No, we're not the cynics. We're not, it's skepticism. It's a different thing. But the thing is, if a word, just because a word is abused, you don't need to retreat from it. You just need to re-own it and redefine it and educate people about it. Because if you simply go and move on to another word, then people will figure out that that's a synonym, and they'll start abusing that one as well. All right, so this is the bulk, the central part of the talk. And I'm going to use, actually, a well-known contributor to Skeptical Inquirer, Susan Hack, who's a world-famous philosopher of science, as help in the sort of conceptualizing these issues. She suggests that there are 6 signs of scientism, of engaging in a scientific attitude toward things. I actually disagree a little bit with Susan, and I'll point out a couple of places where I disagree, which I think are going to be important. And then by the end, we're going to zoom back out into a general discussion of what actually counts as science, because this is really the underlying discussion here. What do we mean when we use the word science, and why do we use it in certain ways rather than others? What's the agenda that we ourselves, I'm not talking about people outside of the community, but people within this community are actually pushing forward. And, the idea is that we should be more careful about using these words, more historically accurate, more sociologically accurate. So, the 6 signs of scientism, I'm going to run them down on this slide, and then we're going to go back to each one of them. First, using words like science and scientific as honorific terms of generic epistemic praise. We just heard almost an entire talk of people doing this sort of stuff, right? Using science, exploiting science as an honorific. Oh, this is scientific, therefore it's good. Adopting the manners and terminology of science regardless of whether they're useful or not. An obsession with demarcating science from pseudoscience. This is actually what I'm going to be disagreeing with Susan. A preoccupation with identifying a scientific method to demarcate science from other activities. This will be a second source of disagreement. An attitude that seeks to deploy science to answer questions beyond its scope, and denying or denigrating the usefulness of non-scientific activities, especially in the humanities. So let's get started with the first one. Using words that, like science or scientific, as honorific terms, as in this case, right? 9 out of 10 dentists recommend whatever. I always wonder what the 10th dentist. Spiro, you should tell me. Maybe you're the 10th dentist. I was like, what does this guy know that the other 9 have not actually caught up with, right? Now, that advertisement is, mildly deleterious. You can just waste your money on bad toothpaste. But in some cases, this kind of science, using science as honorific praise, can actually be really serious stuff. This is a eugenics certificate that was awarded by the American Eugenics Society back in the 1920s that guarantees that the owners of the certificate have been examined, they are the gender of this card, and find a perfect physical and mental balance and unusually strong eugenic love possibilities, well fitted to promote the happiness and future welfare of the race. Yeah, this is science back in 1920, right? And this actually led to significant disruption of a lot of lives. I don't know how many people realize here, but in a couple of decades in the United States, close to 30,000 people were forcibly sterilized because they were declared, scientifically declared, to be one of those categories. These are actual scientific terms. Idiot at the bottom, low-grade imbecile, medium imbecile, high-grade imbecile, and moron. So if you call somebody a moron, you're doing him a favor compared to an idiot. Few people also realize that eugenic laws in some states stayed in the books until the 1960s. And of course, they were used mostly on poor and minorities. So science does damage. And we, as a community that does say go science, and I do say go science, we also have aware of the responsibility. As my friend and greatest philosopher ever lived, Spider-Man, says, with great power comes with great responsibility. Science has great power. Therefore, we have the great responsibilities. And we are, in fact, spokespeople for science. This is what this community actually is. It's a grassroots community for science. Second, adopting the manners and terminology of science, regardless of whether or not they're useful. Like what? Well, one of my favorite examples is a paper in Positive Psychology, published in 2005 by Barbara Fredrickson and Marcial Lozada. They showed, scientific data in hand, that the ratio of positive to negative emotions necessary for human flourishing, whatever the hell that means, I don't know how you measure human flourishing, and how do you exactly partition negative from positive emotions, but anyway, it's exactly 2.9013 to 1. Now, I hope that your bullshit detector is at least on yellow alert here, right? Especially looking at the number of decimals. This is a social science paper. 1 point after the decimal would be suspicious, let alone 4. Sure enough, this got so much attention. This paper was actually, of course, reported by the media and cited hundreds and hundreds of times, so that some big guns finally came back to criticize it. One of the co-authors of this criticism entitled The Complex Dynamics of Wishful Thinking. It's a great article. It's Alan Sokal. The second author there is Alan Sokal, who is the physicist who famously did the original and only worthy, in my opinion, close parentheses, hoax back in the 1990s about postmodernism and physics. Alan Sokal actually said, we got to come out and do something like that. So they explain, this is not an hoax paper. This is actually a very detailed explanation for why it makes absolutely no sense to use those kind of data and those kind of statistics in the paper in question. But it sounded scientific. It got published on a top psychology journal. Number 3, an obsession with demarcating science from pseudoscience. Now, here, Susan says that people that engage in scientism have this kind of obsession. I actually think some of them do, but actually the most prevalent problem is kind of the opposite, and I'll get to that in a second. So this is a book that I co-edited with my friend Martin Baudry for University of Chicago Press a few years ago, The Philosophy of Pseudoscience, where we publish, among other things, this kind of diagram, which is meant to be sort of generically useful, not a specific. It's not based on data. I just drew this by hand. And it shows what I think is a complex map that divides science from some hard science, soft science, quasi-science, bad science, mildly pseudoscientific, all the way down to pseudoscientific. And the point of this diagram was to show, in fact, that there is no sharp demarcation. That we would like to think that there is a clear distinction between science and pseudoscience. Some cases are very clear. HIV denialism, astrology, and so on and so forth. Those are obviously clear. On the other side of the spectrum, on the upper right, there are equally clear examples of sciences that nobody denies, particle physics, evolutionary biology, etc. But then there is a lot of stuff in between that is either weak from an empirical perspective, that's what the vertical axis is showing, or it's weak from a theoretical perspective, that's what the horizontal axis is showing. And some of these things are, in fact, entirely open to discussion. One of the most incredibly active and hot discussions going on right now, it's on the lower right corner, it's about string physics. Some physicists themselves are now throwing the word pseudoscience, or even worse, metaphysics, at people who do string physics. Right? So it's a complex landscape. The point is it's a complex landscape. It's not actually quite that easy necessarily on a case-to-case basis to tell the difference. So that's where I disagree, because I don't think that there is actually an obsession necessarily among supporters of scientism in general about the demarcation. On the contrary, they try to expand as much as possible the definition of science so that to make it all-encompassing. And one of my favorite villains here is my alter ego or arch enemy, whatever you want to call him, Jerry Coyne, who actually went so far as saying that plumbing is about the same as science. It's akin to science. Because, the plumber, when it comes to your home to fix your toilet, has hypotheses about what's wrong with the toilet. It has empirical evidence on the basis of which he tests these hypotheses, and therefore he's doing science. And so I say, okay, well, then I can go to the National Science Foundation with my plumber and get some $100 million to do some research on plumbing. He's clearly trying to extend the definition of science to anything that has to do with thinking straight about facts. But that's way too elastic of a definition of science. It's not socially or historically accurate. This is not, if you ask a scientist, that's not what they will tell you science is. And frankly, if you ask members of the general public, they will say, no, plumbing is not a science. It's My plumber is a nice guy, but he's not a scientist. So, as I said, the problem seems to be the opposite. For instance, anything, even including things that are non-empirical, are often considered by these people to be in fact science, like mathematics. Lawrence Krauss is caught on video on a long debate that he had with Dan Dennett and myself a few years ago in Ghent, Belgium, actually arguing that mathematics is an empirical science. And Dennett I loved his face. He just turned to him and was like, what the hell are you talking about? Now, where does that come from? This is actually an old position in philosophy. This is known as logical positivism. This is a position that was popular in philosophy itself in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s. Guess what? That was almost a century ago. If philosophers have moved on from that kind of position, I think that the rest of us can also update our understanding of how actually science works and what counts as science. Number 4, preoccupation with identifying scientific method to demarcate science. We hear a lot about the scientific method. Every introductory textbook, especially in biology, unfortunately, my own discipline, starts out with, oh, here's the scientific method. And they present you like an algorithm, a little bit of a series of boxes. If you do this and this and this and that, and then you got science on the other side. Well, if it were that easy, then I could just program an algorithm, put it in a computer, and I could go home for the rest of the day. It's not that easy. There is no such thing. This is a fairly established thing now in philosophy of science. There's no such thing as the scientific method. There's a bunch of different explanations for how science works. There's a bunch of different methods and approaches that scientists work. But essentially, the best way to think about the scientific method is it's a toolbox. And it's a toolbox that varies over time, and scientists help themselves to the toolbox with whatever tool it's necessary and happens to work at that particular time. And if that tool stops working or is not appropriate for a particular problem, they just throw it away or throw it back into the toolbox. There is no method. Science is much more creative than people think. Yes, it's systematic. The observations have to be systematic. The experiments have to be systematic. You have to take notes about what you do and that sort of stuff. But if you read a scientific paper, the standard scientific paper starts with an introduction, materials and methods, results and discussion. It's a pure work of fiction. No scientific research ever has actually gone according to what you read in the paper. Okay? This is a reconstruction of how ideally it would have been going if you were a god instead of a scientist. The reality is a hell of a lot more messy. It's like, oh, this worked. This didn't work. Let's throw that out because it didn't work. So here again, I think that the problem, in fact, it's not quite focus on the scientific method or an obsession with the scientific method. It's actually an attempt to try to make science coextensive with reason itself. This also is a very old position in philosophy, and we got over it, so it's time for the rest of you to do it as well. This is a quote, I'm going to read it in full, from one of my favorite philosophers, so this is just to show you that I'm not biased against particular people necessarily. I am biased against certain people, but not necessarily. David Hume. If you don't believe me, I have a tattoo with one of his quotes, so it's really one of my favorite philosophers. But he said in one of his most famous books, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, he was talking about the scholastics. He was referring to, reacting to the scholastic philosophy from the Middle Ages. Let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. It's a beautiful quote. When I was 17, I loved it. Then I grew up. Because what it says basically here is if a book doesn't contain mathematics or science, it's useless. Well, thank God nobody took actually is advised, because there is neither mathematics nor science in the entire Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, one of the best books of modern philosophy. See what I'm talking about? All right, number 5. An attitude that seeks to deploy science to answer questions beyond its scope. Oh, you may say, what questions beyond its scope? Here's a whole list. This is just from philosophy. I'm not going into other areas because I don't know as well. But for instance, just to give you some taste of what I'm talking about. In metaphysics, what is a cause? Causality is fundamental in science, but don't ask a scientist what a cause is, because he's like, I don't know, ask the philosopher. And we will say, well, I have actually 20 different answers. for it. We're still talking about it. In logic, one of the basic instruments in logic is modus ponens, which is a type of inference. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Great. If I were to ask you, well, is that a valid type of inference? What kind of experiment would settle that question? And the answer is none. You have to prove that by logical proof. There's no empirical evidence involved at all. In epistemology, the study of knowledge itself, well, if I define knowledge as Plato did, as justified true belief, what kind of observation would actually falsify that sort of definitions? None, because knowledge is a human concept, so we have to agree and negotiate it. We have to come up with reasons and arguments for why that is a good way of talking or thinking about knowledge. But there isn't going to be an empirical evidence that's going to settle it. In ethics, if I were to ask you, is abortion permissible once the fetus feels pain? Science can tell me when that is. The most likely estimate for when that point is reached through the developmental biology of human fetuses. But why did you pick that particular moment and why that particular criterion? Well, you have to come up with a philosophical argument for that. There is no scientific answer. There's no empirical evidence that can settle that question. In aesthetics, is there a meaningful difference between what John Stuart Mill called high pleasures and low pleasures? You guys are involved right now into high pleasure. This is not praise for me. This is just meaning that you're not having sex, food, or watching sports or something like that, right? Well, is there a difference between these pleasures? Well, a lot of philosophers think that there is a significant difference between the two, but it's kind of hard to pinpoint. And no, you're not going to find the answer in your brain. All you're going to find in your brain is that certain areas of your brain are going to respond one way to certain kinds of pleasures and another way to certain other kinds of pleasures. And that's interesting. That's fascinating. But it isn't going to tell you whether you should value more going to the opera or watching football Monday night. Okay? Philosophy of science. This is my own area. What role does the specific evolutionary process of genetic drift within the general structure of evolutionary biological theory? Try to do an experiment about that. It's not the kind of approach. We need to look at the logical structure of evolutionary theory. We need to talk about what these concepts actually mean and how they play into the theory. And remember, scientific theories are not things out there. They're not Platonic ideal forms that we discover. These are human inventions. These are human constructs that are there to help us make sense of the world. So it's not like we're going to have an answer by looking into a telescope and say, oh yeah, there it is, the ideal theory. Right? It's all here. And finally, philosophy of mathematics. Mathematicians and philosophers of logic have been asking this question for a long time. What is the ontological status of numbers? Do numbers exist? Do mathematicians discover things, or do they invent them? How many people think here that mathematicians discover new things? Raise your hands. A few Platonists. Congratulations. Yeah, most of you are presumably non-Platonists. Well, guess what? Mathematicians are kind of equally split between those two. And no, you cannot do an experiment to settle the matter. Finally, denying or denigrating the usefulness of non-scientific activities, in particular the humanities. Saying things like philosophy is useless because it doesn't contribute to solving scientific problems, like deGrasse Tyson, Hawking, Krauss, Weinberg, and a bunch of others, fundamentally betrays a misunderstanding and, frankly, ignorance of what philosophy is. I actually know several of these people. I know Neil. Unfortunately, I didn't know Stephen Hawking. I know Krauss, and I know Weinberg. And I asked each one of them, how many books, technical books, or papers in philosophy have you ever read? The only one that had read any was Weinberg, and then those papers were decades old. So these people literally don't know what they're talking about. And I'm sorry, but I thought this community was about knowing what we talk about before we talk about it, right? So we need to call our own on these things when they do happen. So we can also use the same argument. It should go on and ask them, one of the assumptions here underlying, for instance, Neil's argument that, cosmology, it's obviously important. I mean, research on the beginning of the universe, it's obviously important. Obviously important? Why is it obviously important? It's interesting to you. It's interesting to me as well. But is it obviously important? Why? Should we spend actually, billions of dollars building the next large telescope or sending people on Mars? Why? there are other priorities. That we can have a reasonable discussion about this kind of stuff. You can come up with reasons, but again, those reasons are not scientific. In fact, Neil himself agrees. He says that the major reason to send people to Mars is to excite the next generation of kids about science. Fine, but maybe we can find cheaper and less dangerous ways to excite kids about science? I don't know. I'm sorry, I have it with Neil because he recently did the ultimate offense. He actually went on Stephen Colbert late night show to debunk Spider-Man. That crossed the line. I'm sorry. No more drinks with Neil. All right, so what it really comes down to, I think, is that what exactly we all mean, especially proponents of scientism, by the word science. And guess what? That's another one of those questions that is not a scientific question. We're not going to settle that by experiment. It is a philosophical question. Now, you can have several reasonable and some unreasonable conceptions of science. The most restrictive definition of science is that, the natural sciences. Biology, chemistry, physics, stuff like that. That's pretty much, everybody is in agreement that, yeah, that's science. That counts as science. Then you can be a little more ambitious and throw in social science. And it's called social science for a reason, because they want to be scientific. Except that it's actually right there, the thing is problematic. Because now you got the human element in. And it's not, I'm not arguing that human beings are somehow outside of nature. Of course we're animals, of course we're natural, et cetera, et cetera. But we're a very kind of special animal. When we do experiments, most psychology experiments are done with psychology undergraduate students. First of all, because they're cheap and easily available. But the problem with psychology undergraduate student is that he might have an idea of what you're up to. And he might not react in a way in which you expect to. There is an element of human will that interferes with these experiments. There is an element of complexity of human behavior that interferes with these experiments. And there is a lot of stuff that it's actually not really quantifiable. So that the social sciences already are borderline between the natural sciences and the humanities. A colleague of mine studies colonialism, for instance, from a social science perspective. And he says, yes, we collect a lot of empirical quantitative data on historical records and things like that. But we also read diaries of people, or novels even, from people that were living under colonialism. Why is that? Those are qualitative data, but those are crucial because they give you an insight in what it was like to live under those conditions, why people were doing certain things rather than others according to their own light. That's not science, that's humanities. It's a borderline field. Then we get outside and get anything that has to do with empirical evidence, including plumbing. By that definition, every time that I get to college, the campus from my apartment on the Upper East Side, and I successfully navigate the subway system in New York, I'm doing science. Because I have a hypothesis in my mind, the map of Manhattan, and I test it empirically every day, and sometimes the test actually fails because the damn subway is not running. And then even more so, reason more broadly construed. Well, fine, two can play this game. So Lawrence Krauss once said, basically philosophy is really just a branch of science. I said, you got it exactly the other way around, at least if you look at it historically. We came first. You guys were called natural philosophers until you guys, when I say you guys, I should include myself because I'm a biologist. But the word science is actually remarkably recent. It was introduced by a philosopher, interestingly, William Whewell, who was one of Darwin's mentors. And it was introduced in 1834. And it didn't catch up until the late 1800s, early 1900s. Up until that time, Darwin himself called himself a natural philosopher. And there was a good reason to introduce the distinction because the natural sciences were getting more and more independent from more standard kind of philosophy. And interestingly, this is one of the things that amuses me, the word scientist actually was coined by Will because, in analogy with artist, he said, well, we have people over here doing arts, and we call them artists. We have people over here doing science, because the term science itself is older. Why don't we call them scientists? So scientists are analogous to artists. That's the origin of the word. Now, this is not to say that the sciences, even in the most narrowly construed version, don't grade into and are continuous with, in fact, other disciplines. Of course they are. In fact, I think a better map of the situation with respect to what I just showed you is this. Imagine mathematics, natural science, social science, logic, both formal and not, and philosophy, I think that a reasonable map is something like this. Okay. They all interact, they all inform each other. You cannot do modern philosophy if you don't pay attention to what the scientists are doing. You can't do philosophy of biology without knowing biology. But by the same token, if you're a biologist, you take a lot of philosophical baggage, either unexamined, as Daniel Dennett famously said, or you just don't know about it. Okay. You're ignorant about it. So, in the end, where is it that I stand? There definitely is such a thing, I think, as scientism, and it is harmful to public intellectual discourse. One of the reasons we need to be careful is because if we overpromise, then we fail to deliver, and you heard the previous talk, it all comes down to a matter of trust. The public has to trust scientists and has to trust skeptics. If they lose trust, then we got trouble. And if one good way to lose trust is by overpromising, not delivering, and then people are going to say, hey, wait, you said that last time, and that didn't work out. Susan's analysis is, I think, useful, but as I said, she misdiagnoses, I think, a couple of points, which I pointed out. Scientism is often defended on the basis of a fallacy of equivocation, which we should know better as skeptics, meaning an equivocation on the term science. Science is not a universal construct. It's not an immovable thing. It's not a Platonic ideal. It's a human activity, and therefore it has evolved over the 2,000 years. Aristotle was doing science, was doing biology and physics. Was he wrong about the specifics? Of course so, but so is every scientist alive today. He will be proven wrong probably within the next 20 years. So that's not the point. The point is that science has been done and keeps being done in different ways over different times. So really science is simply what scientists do. Okay? And scientists don't do a lot of the stuff that these people pretend that they do. Rejecting scientists does not imply the acceptance of any sharp or artificial demarcation either between science and pseudoscience or science and philosophy and stuff like that. So, I'm going to quote Alan Sokal here. He famously said at the end of that Oakes paper that I mentioned earlier, when one analyzes postmodernist writings on science, one often finds radical-sounding assertions whose meaning is ambiguous and that can be given two alternative readings. One is interesting, radical, and grossly false. The other, boring and trivially true. Now, if you substitute scientific for postmodernist and unknowledge for unscience, then you can quote me on that one. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that bell to be notified about new videos. You can follow us on social media, and if you really love what we do, consider supporting us with a donation. Links to all that good stuff is in the description below.